everyone, welcome. Um, my name is Loz Emerson. I'm from the Natural History Consortium, who have organised the Citizen Science Showcase, which is a programme of events that's been happening all over this week, and it's all about helping connect people to citizen science projects that are taking place across Wessex area. And citizen science is essentially where everyday people can get involved in collecting or analysing data that helps us mostly to understand our natural world a bit better. So the showcase is part of a wider project that we're doing called the Citizen Science Local Pilot, that's working to help make improvements to citizen science across particularly Somerset, Wiltshire, the west of England, and Dorset. And it's supported by Natural England and funded by the government's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We're really delighted to be finding out a bit more about the work of the Badger Trust and how you can get involved. Just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded, but if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we'll have some time to go through a bit of a Q&A at the end. So I'm now going to hand straight over to Victoria Colton to introduce herself. Thanks, and over you to Victoria.
Thanks so much, Lars. Yeah, it's really lovely to see everyone today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Right. Yeah, please let me know if anyone has any questions throughout the project, throughout the talk. Please do put them in the chat. Thank you so much for that intro. And today, as Lars said, I am Victoria and I have been working as a research assistant for Badger Trust for almost 2 years now. And I've been primarily working on the State of the Badger project, which is a citizen science project looking into badger populations. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what State of the Badger is and why it's so important. We're going to talk a little bit about the different citizen science methods and approaches we're using. And then we'll review some of the findings from our pilot study and then talk a little bit about what's next for the project too. So firstly, who is Badger Trust? So Badger Trust's mission is to promote and enhance the welfare, conservation and protection of badgers, and this includes their sets and their habitats. And we are the leading voice for badgers in England and Wales, with a network of around 50 local badger groups run by volunteers. So the State of the Badger project is Badger Trust's first research initiative, and it aims to provide an up-to-date estimate on badger populations, as well as different aspects of data on the badger population health, and it's running across England and Wales. So as part of this project, we also want to encourage more people to learn about badgers and connect with nature as well. So firstly, why are badgers so important? So some of you might be very familiar with badgers and know a lot about them, but for anyone that doesn't know so much, badgers are what is known as an ecosystem engineer, and that means they have quite a large impact on the environment around them and they help to shape the ecosystem. So these graphics here from Scottish badgers really nicely demonstrate how badgers can help with seed dispersal and with maintaining soil health, as well as providing food and habitats for lots of other different species. And with an ongoing biodiversity crisis in the UK, the support that these badgers provide to ecosystems and to other species is really vital at the moment, so we can keep those ecosystems healthy and functioning. So why estimate population sizes? So we know they're important, but why do we want to estimate their populations? So monitoring badgers is, or monitoring any wildlife species, is really essential for conservation and for wildlife management. If we don't know how many individuals are in a population, then we can't see how that population might respond in response to different things. So for example, if a population is under pressure from climate change or from any human impacts, then we need to monitor them to make sure we can identify these changes in populations. And then hopefully if we see anything concerning in those population trends, then we can plan some interventions if we need to. So we're not starting from scratch. There have been 3 previous national population surveys in England and Wales. The first one was in the 80s by Creswell, the second in the 90s by Wilson, and then most recently in 2011 to 2013 by Judge et al. But this was quite a while ago, so we are definitely due for another population count. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, since that last estimate, there has been a cull over most of South and Southwest England, with just under half of that last estimated number now have been culled as part of that. So this has the potential to have a massive impact, not just on the badger populations themselves, but also on the biodiversity of the entire ecosystems that badgers help to shape. So it's never really been more important to assess how that population is doing. So how do we go about this? Estimating population sizes of badgers is a little bit tricky because badgers are so difficult to monitor. They're obviously very secretive and they're nocturnal. Very few people have actually seen a live badger. I know that I've only ever seen one once. But we do know that we can see evidence of their presence in the landscape. And we do know that badgers live in very tight-knit social groups called clans. So to estimate population sizes, we need two pieces of information. So the first is the number of those social groups, and the second is how big those social groups are on average. So firstly, to look at the number of social groups, this is actually quite simple. So each badger clan will hold a piece of land and hold a territory. And in this territory, there'll be lots of different burrows, which we call sets. But in those territory, there will usually only be one main set. And the main set will be the main hub of activity. It will be constantly active. It will be where most of the breeding takes place, and it will be really well connected to the other sets or any other resources in their territory, such as foraging grounds. It will be really well connected by distinctive paths. So here's an example of a main set in County Durham. So you can see there those paths that are leading along the side of the hill and up the bank are very well worn away. And if you can see on the right-hand side, you can just about make out a lighter coloured piece of earth, and that is a spoil heap from a different kind of set. And you can see the path runs all the way along that hill over to that other set, so it's very well connected. So if we're looking at the number of social groups in an area, if we count those number of main sets we can find, if we can identify them, then we can be fairly confident that this is the number of social groups. However, realistically, we can't survey every single inch of the country and count all the main sets. So what we do in any science, any kind of population survey, is we take a smaller subset of that area, and then we extrapolate this information across the rest of the area. So, for example, very simplistically, if this is our study area and it's a nice big woodland, the trees are definitely not to scale. Then if we find 10 main sets in the left-hand side, then theoretically we would also find 10 main sets on the right-hand side, which seems fairly simple, but we also need to consider that there's probably going to be factors that might skew the population to one side. So for example, if there was more suitable terrain in one half of this woodland, then there might be more likely to have sets there. So realistically, a sample of this woodland would look something more like this with some randomly selected survey plots. So then thinking about that and then moving on to national distributions of badgers. So we know that badgers don't exist at the same densities across England and Wales. And we can see those differences in the previous surveys that have grouped land into different, they're called land classification groups. And those groups are based on landscape characteristics, habitats, and land use in those areas. So we can see here, these are the results from the last population census. There are much higher densities of social groups in the west and the southwest, and much lower densities in the north and in the upland areas. So there's quite a clear divide here, kind of roughly north to southwest. So we need to make sure that we're taking account of these differences when we're estimating populations over such a massive area. So for example, if we were just to survey in the orange and the green, then we would get a much higher overall estimate of social group density. Whereas if we were to survey in just the yellow and the red, we'd get a much lower number than the true number of social groups. So we must be very careful when we're designing where to survey, and make sure that the sample that we are taking is representative. So this measurement of social group density has been used in the previous surveys, and it is quite a good indication of overall badger population health, or it has been, but it doesn't give us an accurate abundance or account of how many badgers there actually are in England and Wales. And that uncertainty comes from the second piece of information we need, which is how many badgers are in those social groups. So this is where it gets a little bit more tricky. It's quite difficult data to get. So some of the early estimates, I believe the 1980s study used an average for the whole country. So I think it was between 4 and 7 badgers. But it was only in the most recent survey that they started to account for this regional difference in social group sizes. And as with the set density data, the average social group size does change quite considerably between these different land class groups. So here's the data from 2011 to 2013. And this was estimated using genetic analysis of badger hairs that were collected during the set surveys. So this is quite difficult and it's quite expensive to do. So you need to make sure that the hairs that are collected are of good enough quality to be able to run the genetic analysis. And so for this study in particular, they only managed to collect data for 89 sets over the whole area. And as you can see, in some of these regions, as little as 3 groups were surveyed. So the yellow area at the top, the average was based on just 3 groups they could get enough data for. So to get a very accurate estimate of social group sizes, we need a really big sample size within each of those areas. And unfortunately, we also know that culling has disrupted social groups. So a lot of this data, particularly in the south and the southwest, is now likely to be no longer accurate. So it would need to be retested and validated. So based on these two things, estimating badger population abundance seems, in theory at least, quite simple. However, practically, possibly quite a big endeavour. But at Badger Trust, we wanted to see if we could get citizen scientists like yourself involved to see if we could achieve this through engagement with the public as well. So to get a robust estimate of a national badger population, we would need to cover a massive amount of land. So at minimum, based on the previous surveys, we would need to survey around 1% of each of those land class groups. So excluding any habitats where we know badgers aren't found, then that's about 1,500 square kilometres. However, we'd also want to survey more intensively in areas where they're more likely to be found. It's a method called a random stratified sample. So you survey more intensively in areas of high badge density and slightly less so in areas of low badge density. And this improves the precision of the statistics that are applied. So this approach was taken in those previous surveys, and they actually ended up surveying closer to 2,500 square kilometres. So this is a massive undertaking, and it would probably take quite a long time. I believe the previous surveys were at least 2 to 3 years of surveying. And of course, we also can't survey for badgers in the summer, so this does extend it out quite a lot as well. But we already have a really big network of badger lovers in this country. We can see this through our groups and our supporters. So we wondered if we could get them to help us to cover a much larger area, with the added advantage of local knowledge in your local areas. But of course, any volunteer help, we would need to make sure that the results of those surveys are accurate and robust, which is why we need some really, really clear training. And the training for our project is probably slightly more intensive than a lot of the other showcase events that have gone on this week. So for volunteers to be able to record this data, they would need to learn quite a lot of fieldcraft related to badgers and how to recognise those signs of badger activity that many of us would probably walk past if we didn't know what we're looking for. So for example, here on the bottom left, you can see a badger paw print in the mud. So volunteers would need to be able to recognise what a badger paw print looks like, but also differentiate that from something like a dog or from any other mammal they might come across. Similarly, at the top there, a badger latrine, which is essentially a badger toilet. Volunteers would need to be able to identify these. And then also mammal paths are very common. I'm sure a lot of you see them when you're out and about, but there are very specific markers in a mammal path that you can tell if it's being used by badgers. And these are the kind of things we would need volunteers to be able to spot. And then most importantly, volunteers would need to recognise and identify the different types of badger sets that they might encounter. And crucially tell the difference between a main set and any other type of set they might find, so that we can get that crucial data on the number of social groups. But what about social group sizes? This does become a little bit more difficult to recruit citizen scientists to help, but certainly not impossible. And actually, given the very low number of data points the previous study had, if we can get some citizen scientists to help with this, then maybe we can actually increase that data set. So one way would be to have any volunteers that are going out doing surveys to collect any hair samples that they found, either when they're just out and about or when they're on set surveys. And then they could send them off to a lab or to us for the same kind of analysis. However, this is logistically quite difficult. The hair samples taken would need to make sure of their sufficient quality to be able to get that genetic information. Not to mention it's quite expensive to do this kind of lab work. So we had a look at different methods that we might be able to use during our pilot study, which included camera trapping. So theoretically, if camera traps could be used to estimate social group sizes, and if we could develop a protocol for this, then people all around the country that have their own camera traps, or if they're able to borrow them from us or from any other nature organisation, then they could set up cameras in their local woodlands or in their gardens, and then send us their results of how many badgers they see. And then we can develop a national database and then hopefully get a more accurate estimate of the average social group sizes in each of those line classification groups. So this was a very small pilot that we ran this year. And the results were promising, but this method still does need a bit more research and validation before we could roll it out on any kind of larger scale. But the big advantage of the camera trapping is that we can get citizen scientists involved in a much more inclusive way. So regardless of whether we're having professional people going out to do the camera trapping or we're having citizen scientists upload camera trap images or videos, we can upload them to websites like this one, MammalWeb. So if you're not familiar with MammalWeb, it's a citizen science platform where various camera trapping projects from around the country and I believe around the world can upload their images and their videos to the website, and then anyone can log on, create an account, and you can view those images and help the scientists to classify the mammals that they see in those images. So if you head to the projects page, we actually do have our pilot project on there. As you can see, it's 71% classified as of a few days ago. So if anyone does have any time, then feel free to log on there and you can help us get to 100%. And it's a really nice kind of mindful activity. I quite enjoy going on there and looking at the videos of the badger cubs playing while also classifying the data. It's really nice to do. So I do recommend checking that one out if anyone's not familiar. Okay, so once we have the population sizes, what else do we need to know in order to monitor population health over time? And how can we get citizen science involved with this? So we would need to know how fast populations would grow naturally. And this would be through births or through immigration into an area, if you're looking at a specific area. And then we need to know how much populations decline naturally, and that would be through deaths or through emigration, if you're looking at a specific area. So if we look at these average figures for a year, we could then predict how populations will change over time without any external factors. But we know that badgers are subject to quite a few external factors and non-natural mortality. Specifically, in this country, badgers are very at risk from roadkill. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have probably seen a dead badger on the side of the road, unfortunately, as well as badger crime and, of course, culling can all impact the population. So a really, really easy way for citizen science to get involved with this badger population health data is by reporting that roadkill that you see. So unfortunately, we just don't know how many badgers are killed every year on roads. So the more data we have on this, the more accurate our estimate can become. And Badger Trust is working closely with Road Lab at Cardiff University on this data. And reporting any badgers that you see on the side of the road to either Badger Trust or to Road Lab help us improve our understanding of the impact that this could have on badger populations. So, for example, Road Lab published a paper a few years ago now looking at how badger roadkill changes over different seasons. And this graph here is from that research, and it quite clearly confirms that there is a very clear peak in roadkill in the spring in the next few months, and then a lesser peak in the autumn as well. And information like this can help us to plan interventions or our campaigns, so we can safely say that we know that roadkill is going to peak in the next few months. So drivers on the road at this kind of time of year should be extra careful. So more recently, we've been working with Road Lab on data that's been submitted from the public and from our badger groups. as well as from volunteers that participated in our State of the Badger pilot. And this study is looking at spatial trends in roadkill across Britain, which is primarily road types, whether it's a road or a motorway, for example, and also looking at some characteristics of those roads to see if they impacted the probability of roadkill being found. And unfortunately, I'm not able to tell you too much more about that research, as the paper is currently in the process of being published. But it will be out in the next few months, and we'll be sharing it on our socials, I'm sure, so on our website. So the data collected and research like this can help us plan those interventions. So if we identify any hotspots or high-risk road types, then we could look into ways to hopefully try and reduce it. So we could implement barriers on the road if we know that certain road characteristics can prevent roadkill, or we could put up road signs like this one. So moving on to badger crime. So unfortunately, badger crime is not a notifiable offence. So police forces don't really have any long-term records of badger crime or wildlife crime generally. And this type of crime also tends to happen in quite remote and rural places. So the system is completely reliant on people reporting those offences and recognising that an offence has taken place. So to help with this, Badger Trust has developed the Badger Watch app. And this allows people to learn about different types of badger crime. It's also got a lot of images on there as examples. And you can also report any crimes that you see through the app as well. So many of our groups and our volunteers have been using this app, and we've always made sure that our State of the Badger volunteers have this downloaded in case they see anything concerning when they're out and about doing surveys. And then by monitoring and analysing this data, it can help us to understand just how big of a problem this is, as well as identifying any hotspots or high-risk habitat types. And this can then hopefully help us understand how this might be affecting the population over time. Okay, so that is a good overview of why and how we use citizen science to monitor badger populations. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how badger trusts have started to implement some of these methods over the last few years through the State of the Badger project. So we started a pilot study at the end of 2023, and the aim of this was to test some of these different approaches. We wanted to learn what worked and what needed a bit more attention, and also look into how training could be delivered effectively. So the main bulk of this project was those set surveys, and all our results have been compiled into the pilot report. And we're working now to create some summary graphics that we can publish that will highlight some of the key findings. So do keep an eye on our socials and our website for those in the next few weeks. So through the pilot, which was run in these 4 counties that are highlighted, so we established a scientific advisory board first, and this was made up of numerous academics from different institutions around the country, and their role was to advise on the scientific methods and the statistics. We also developed and tested an app for surveyors so that the surveyors could use their phones to enter their data in the field and then upload it straight to our server. And then we also developed some resources to aid in training. For example, a very well illustrated field guide that would help identify those badger signs and those different types of sets that were so crucial. So we've been blown away by the support of the citizen science scientists that got involved in the pilot. So we had over 200 volunteers sign up to participate. We had 10 practical training workshops, which taught those volunteers how to identify those signs and those sets. And these were run with the help of some brilliant ecologists and the local badger groups in those areas. And these were really brilliant events to learn about badgers, but also to connect with volunteers and to see volunteers networking and connecting with each other. It was really lovely to see. So overall, the pilot survey had 91 survey sites completed, and this covered a little bit over 50 kilometres squared. Okay, so moving on to some of our results. So these are some very approximate survey locations within our pilot counties. And you can clearly see that the counties of Somerset and Devon on the left, the survey sites were much less evenly distributed than in Hampshire and Lancashire on the right-hand side. So this reflects the different approaches that we employed for land access in these counties. So in Devon and Somerset, we anticipated there would be a bit more pushback from landowners and a bit unlikely to get as much land access from private land. So in these areas, we only surveyed in areas that were either open access or where we sought permission from large landowners, for example, the National Trust or Wildlife Trust, or I believe some Forestry England sites as well. Whereas in Lancashire and Hampshire, we sent letters out to landowners, to private landowners, requesting access to land. And this was a letter followed by a leaflet, and it had a opt-in or out approach. And we assumed that any non-response was a opt-out. So this was a challenge, and we knew it was going to be. We knew there was going to be a very low uptake of private land, but we did feel like this was worthwhile because we wanted to see just how low that uptake would be. So I think I think it was between 200 and 300 letters that were sent out. Less than 10% of those got a response, and half of those responses denied us access to their land. So this did force us to kind of adapt our approach to the surveying. So we surveyed a bit more flexibly to make sure we could maximise the coverage of private land that we did get access to. And it also meant we opted for more open access sites. So I believe well over 50% of the areas that we surveyed were open access land. So looking at the habitat coverage that was achieved, as we were only taking a small subset of those counties, of the country even, we looked at the land classification groups, but we also looked at the smaller scale habitats, which are shown in the map here. So as you can see, the graph shows that the highest coverage was improved grassland and broadleafed woodland habitats. But interestingly, there's also quite a high coverage of heather type habitats and other habitats that are associated with uplands, such as the acid grassland. And this reflects the high amount of surveys that were in those open access areas, as open access areas do tend to be upland areas and moorland. So that's why we had such a high representation there. So looking at the information that was recorded on those surveys, so 64% of survey sites recorded some kind of badger activity, and paths were the most commonly recorded sign of activity, followed by dung pits or latrines, and then badger footprints, and then badger hairs. So 140 sets were recorded in total, and just under 78% of these were active. 50 of those sets were classified as main sets, and 90% of these were active, so there was 45 main sets, active main sets. And 71% of the other sets that were identified were active, which is to be expected as these sets are used less frequently than a main set would be. So in terms of the sets we found, so just under half of the survey sites had at least one set, and 22% had at least one active main set. And the pie chart on the right shows the habitats where those sets were found. So unsurprisingly, 60% of those sets were in broadleaf woodland, which is unsurprising considering we know that that is where badgers prefer to build their sets. So we did identify some areas that we needed to improve our training. So signs around sets were asked to be recorded to confirm whether or not a set was active. So things like bedding material, which you can see in that image on the left, badgers will take plant material, plant matter into their sets to bed down in, and they'll clear this out quite regularly. So you can usually see this outside an active set, as well as things like spoil heaps, footprints or hairs can confirm that a set is active. However, we didn't get this reported for around just over 20% of the sets that were reported to us. So we need to make sure that our training is adapted going forward to make sure that volunteers understand how to identify these things, but also how to record the data as well. And importantly, why they need to record this data and how important it is. So we also asked volunteers to record any instances of disturbance to sets they found. And only 5 instances were recorded over the whole area. All of these were on active main sets, 4 were open access and 1 was private land. And instances were all quite minor or historical, so it was old signs of digging that had already been reported, or a few instances where sticks, branches or debris were placed in the entrance of a set. So arguably, the most important part of a pilot phase of any citizen science project is the feedback that we receive from volunteers about their experience. So crucially, Less than 17% of our participants responded to our survey. So this is my very shameless plea for anyone taking part in citizen science projects. If you do get sent a feedback survey after the project, please do try and take the time to complete it. So feedback not only helps the projects adapt and move forward and improve the volunteer experience, it's also often a really key component to evaluate those projects, and future funders and partners will want to see that kind of data. So firstly, we wanted to see how people found out about the project. And most commonly, this was through their local Badger group, followed by the Badger Trust website and then social media. And a few of our volunteers reported finding out about the project through more than one of these platforms. And then next, we wanted to understand what motivated people to sign up to the project. And here you have the results on the right. So love of badgers was the most common response, followed by supporting the organisation and contribution to research, as well as gaining experience in ecological surveying. So from our training events, over 94% of our respondents indicated that the workshops were available in that area. They were easy to sign up to, they were delivered by knowledgeable trainers, and they provided opportunities to connect with other volunteers. And 94% also said that they felt prepared to complete their surveys following a training workshop, so we were quite happy with this. So looking forward, we asked volunteers to rank their priorities for the project going forward, to help us improve and streamline our approach. So this told us that small group surveying events, more accessible resources, so for example, printed survey packs, with the field guides, for example, and communication were the highest priorities. So that would be more social media engagement and newsletters that go out regularly to our signed up volunteers. And then finally, over 90% of our participants said they were likely or highly likely to participate in the project going forward. So what have we learned from our pilot phase? So citizen scientists are brilliant at this. We were really blown away how quickly people picked up on the field signs, and how engaged people were in the workshops and in the project after the workshops. So while the data from the pilot survey is really important and it can point us towards improving the project, we do need much larger scale and more intensive surveying to make any kind of national estimate, which, as we know, is quite a huge undertaking. We also confirmed that land access was going to be the biggest challenge for surveys. So as we know, badgers are not everyone's favourite animal. There's always some controversial politics to navigate. So this did translate into the low uptake of land access that we had for our surveys. And then finally, on the logistical side, we did find that the allocation of survey squares was quite a time-intensive process for our staff. So one of the things we're looking to do going forward is to have an online platform that allows volunteers to select surveys that might be available in their area. And they can manage the surveys themselves alongside viewing all the resources and information they need in that one place. So up next, we have now submitted a funding bid for the next phase of the project. And if this is successful, it will be a more intensive regional study combining all of the things we've learned from our pilot into one county, and that will be in Gloucestershire. And this is because that is one of the counties where culling first started. So although this is just outside of the Wessex area, if anyone does want to sign up to participate, if you're able to travel for surveys, or even if you just want to hear updates about the project, please do head to our website and sign up using the form at the bottom of the State of the Badger page. And of course, there are lots of other ways you can get involved to help badger research all over the country, regardless of where you are. So if you head to our reporting centre on the Badger Trust website, you can use that centre to report any dead badgers you see that have been hit by cars. You can also report any set locations or badger crimes that you might come across. And of course, we do have the Badger Watch app, which has lots of information on the different types of badger crime, as well as the ability to report any crimes you see using the app. And of course, I actually forgot to add this in, but you can also go onto the website on MammalWeb to help us classify and finish classifying those camera trap images. And of course, you can always join your local badger group. So there is a group in Somerset and there is a group in Gloucestershire. But if there's a group near you, if you head on to this website here, you'll be able to see any groups near you and find their contact information as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I think we've got loads of time for questions, so please do pop your questions in the chat if you have any. If we're not able to get to anything, get to your question this evening, or if anything occurs to you later, please do feel free to contact me on that email address at the bottom of the page.